So now we'd like to move on to our first session. And of course, I don't have the agenda with me. There we go. And this is typically an opening session, although we have a little twist to it this year. This is your CLL 101, Reimagined, Connecting Science, Support, and Advocacy. So what makes it different this year? We have two speakers, two clinicians, clinical speakers, who can speak to different challenges and a different perspective on CLL one in high income countries and one in the low middle income countries. And beyond that, we have a couple of advocate panelists who can respond and speak as an advocate and as a patient as well. So I would like to call those folks to the stage in our next session. That's Ben Kennedy and Oliver Karanfilski. Sorry if I mispronounced it. Jana, Pelouchova, and Brian Koffman. And I apologize, I'm half blind, so sometimes it gets a little hard to read. So they're each going to give their perspective, and then after that, there'll be a chance for questions, hopefully. So I'd like to call on Ben Kennedy, Dr. Ben Kennedy, if he can, to come forward. He works as a consultant hematologist, treating patients in clinic and on the day care unit. He performs diagnostic laboratory work and has been interested in the doctor-patient community and advocacy for many years. He supports CLL Ireland and has been a long-standing medical advisor to CLL support in the UK. Again, as with all these speakers, they are quite accomplished, and I could go on and on. Ben, I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a lovely introduction. It's really great to be here with you in Krakow. I'm very grateful to the organizers for this really kind invitation. Really, really pleased to be here. This is a perspective. So allegedly I work in a high-income country. It doesn't always feel like that. There's a lot that we take for granted, but there are challenges as well. Now, if you'd asked me maybe 10 years ago, what do? I'd say, I've been looking after people with CLL for 20 years. Moving forward another 10 years, I don't say that. I say I've been working with people who have CLL for 30 years, more. And I think that is almost a summary of what I want to say, because I think this is all about the relationships that we have with our patients, with the people who come to us. So there's a number of things I want to touch on. I hope at this limited time, I'll try and go through it. I think firstly, we have access to so many different things. We have access to blood analyzers, tertiary care, specialist nurses, clinical trials, you name it. I could just rattle through a list and then walk off the stage and say, these are all the wonderful things we have. But we also have some major challenges, as Nick has said earlier, about the shifting horizons of what begins to challenge us and what is the changing nature of the work that we have. So just to sort of highlight a few things. Firstly, I think people will come to me in the clinic sooner rather than later because of access to blood counts. That they'll have an abnormal blood count and they'll come to me, and then that they're going to have a whole array of support during that time, access to clinical nurse specialists, for example. But it means that they're unlikely to require pharmacological intervention, not likely to require treatment. if that's as the narrow definition that we give to treatment. But I think that concept is also shifting, that when we speak of active monitoring, that is also a kind of treatment. It's a bit of a two-edged sword, perhaps, because as soon as the genie is out of the bag and we say the word leukemia, we say the word cancer, there is no going back. You can't stuff the genie back into the bag. But what we can do is work with those people to say, right, it's early days. You're not going to need treatment for a while. What can we do? So there is then this opportunity and challenge to maximize how you can live well. So we can begin to think about that. We can begin to think about diet and exercise and those things. Is that a bit of a luxury to do that? To address some of the psychological and emotional impacts that active monitoring will really have on our patients. But that's a huge part of life now, is living with this diagnosis which is suddenly being given to us at an early stage simply because we have access to a blood analyzer. We touched on this idea of immunity. Now, I can take it for granted that I have access to vaccines, to antibiotics, to a range of specialist services, to CT scanners and various things, various diagnostic microbiology laboratories, etc. But what I can't say is that we don't have a challenge with the understanding, with the appreciation of, with the education about the challenges of the immune system. And I often say to my patients, look, CLL it's like an immunological problem. It's something that affects your immune system that's masquerading as a cancer almost. It's a real immunological challenge. And that awareness is something that I still work with and encourage my colleagues and my patients to understand better. Because this is something that I think is one of the biggest areas of unmet need in how to live well with CLL. And underestimating the risk of infection where the immune system declines, the body's ability to fight infection declines inexorably over time, and introducing treatment doesn't necessarily make that better. It often makes it worse. Okay? So longer courses of antibiotics, access to vaccines, great. Cigarette smoking, I can refer to a stop smoking clinic. Structural lung disease, chronic bronchitis and emphysema is a major problem. Stop smoking is a really important message for my patients. I can refer to a respiratory specialist. I can refer to the stop smoking clinic, and fewer people will smoke these days in a high-income country anyway. So that's a good thing, but understanding the risk of infection, I think, is a big unmet need. Advocacy and information. We're so fortunate that we have groups like CLL Advocates Network and all the local, national groups that support our patients. CLL Ireland, CLL Support in the UK, Leukemia Care. So many amazing organizations that will provide trustworthy information. And if there is no trustworthy information, what do people do? They go and look on the internet. Well, we've got access to the internet. And the information out there is not regulated. It's not curated and presented carefully. It's a bit random. So there has to be ways of helping people to understand that. And I think the network of advocates and of clinical nurse specialists is something that will help people to understand the quality of the information that's out there. And that isn't always the case, and that's a real challenge. So signposting to trustworthy information. It's a big, big deal. And it's something that we're still working on, aren't we? This is not perfect with us. Shared decision making. And this begins to come to the heart of what I think is my thoughts on this message. A well-informed patient is really the key starting point to making shared decisions. This is not always about disease biology. It's about putting an equal emphasis on how people see the goals of their treatment. So as a clinician and as a patient, we don't necessarily have conflicting goals and intended outcomes. We have complementary goals, and it's a question of working together to identify where that balance lies, how it all fits together into something that is coherent and valuable for our patients. We talk about sequencing, so we have the luxury of multiple, well-tolerated, highly effective treatments. So I can say to my patient, well, what's important to you and what might be important to me in terms of doing the prognostic markers, which is very straightforward and easy to access. I can do TP53 and IGHV mutation analysis, etc. And then put that together with my patient and say, okay, what's important to you in the first line of treatment, the second line of treatment, where are we going to go first? So you will hear these terms about sequencing as well on multiple occasions about where do we go with the first, where do we go with the second. That's something that is perhaps something I begin to take for granted because we're looking at small molecule directed therapies and how they work best together. So I think there is generally a sense that control and empowerment is moving into the patient space and into those people I see in the clinic, that we are beginning to understand each other and work better together. It doesn't detract from things like clinical trials in any sense. The world of science and scientific endeavor is so important, and it has brought us to where we are. And so we must consider, how do we best make use of the different treatments that we've got? How do we define treatment outcomes? So we might be, we talk very openly or glibly about minimal or measurable residual disease, for example, as a treatment outcome. And that was something that Jana showed us on the clinical trials website, and putting that into an AI, easy-to-read framework, which is amazing. But I think the next step is the development of the patient-public involvement and engagement, the PPIE groups, to help us to understand what should be the goals of research. How do we use outcomes of quality of life, reported outcomes? How do we assess the true impact of these treatments on our patients? And understanding what we're doing. To say that a drug is well tolerated isn't necessarily to understand the impact that it has on people's lives. And so I think that it's not just about MRD assessments, although we can do that. It's about better engagement and setting those shared goals with our patients. So I think that overall, coming back to what I said originally, I think there is a changing nature. What I'm seeing is a changing nature in the relationship between ourselves as clinicians and our patients who we want to work with to achieve the goals that matter to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very clear message there. Our second speaker is Professor Dr. Oliver Karanfilski, and I apologize if the pronunciation is a little bit off. Dr. Karanfilski is a professor of internal medicine and hematology with more than 40 years of experience working in the public health sector until 2023. At present, he is a consultant in hematology at a comprehensive private clinical hospital, dealing with all hematological conditions, both benign and neoplasms. He's also a founding member of the Macedonian CML Patients Association. If you could, sir, if you could take stage and bring some remarks.
I live in a country where letters are pronounced as they're written, so it's very easy to read my name. Thank you for the invitation. I was actually surprised that I got invited to this because, as you heard, my service in the public sector has been over for 2 and some years. But then the people that invited me said, yeah, but you have the experience, so it's good that you will be the speaker at this. This is just a reminder for which session this was, and please move to the other slide, which only serves as my note for what I need to say in this session. Thank you. If you look up my country, North Macedonia, in the map of income, it will stand even under upper middle. That's when you consider other countries in the world. If you look in Europe, we're at the absolute rock bottom, or next to rock bottom. So I'm here to deliver the perspective for a less fortunate country and the people who live in it. The problem in diagnostics could be limited to non-availability of maybe all necessary diagnostic procedures, but you will come up to what this means, let's say for inclusion in clinical trials. If there is a prerequisite that you have a certain diagnostic procedure for including patients and you don't have it, then you're automatically off the chart for including patients with CLL in any kind of study or trial. Maybe some of the things we skipped doing, let's say the normal karyotype, which now becomes a prerequisite in some studies. We've moved to molecular genetics and PCR and stuff like that, so it's coming back. Maybe it will be a problem. Then you also need to know how to distinguish CLL from some other very similar diagnosis. And that can be an issue if you're missing the complete panel of investigations necessary for that. What I'm actually trying to convey to you in this session is that you need, as a professional, to have upgraded and updated education. And as patients, it's their right to search for such a doctor. You don't go to the doctor because there is a large company logo over my head. You go because you can find out that that and that doctor has had education in this and that and knows what he's talking or she's talking about. And that's where you deliver, where you communicate the trust. Trust between patients and doctors are the fundamentals of everything we can do in favor of the patient's destiny. This is the most important thing. So, enough talking about the clinical trials. You're clear that we have very few patients enrolling in those. So that's my perspective as a country. Since the population has been less fortunate as a general, you would probably find out that my patients are not very highly educated or very well spoken or very well intellectually up to the level that they can read Google and everything else. Whatever patients do, please tell them not to look at blogs. Please make them follow medical literature. If they want to talk with a doctor about that, please be based on medical literature, not my neighbor had that disease and they took care of it in this and that way. That's different. So mainly when we talk to patients about choosing treatment, it's mainly what the doctor recommends. There can be discussions, there can be modifications, but my opinion is we don't undertreat the patient on account of his or her wishes. Rather, present the actual consequence or advantage of a certain treatment, and on informed basis, reach a consensual solution. Initial genetics are not performed mandatory, so that might be a little problem. Mostly, we do them when we decide to commence treatment. So that may also influence the choice of treatment regimen. The current maximum availability in North Macedonia is presented to you with these 3 drugs. They're not on the so-called reimbursement list. They're on something that you would be amazed to hear the expression conditional budget, which is something like with the reimbursement fund, they allow you a certain amount of money to buy new novel drugs. If you report that you have spent them in the last year, they will allow it to you next year. But that's also a maybe. They may decide that the fund doesn't have enough money for that, so next year you're not going to have it. The only solution for access to medicine for all patients is for a drug to be on the so-called positive list or reimbursement list. If that's the maximum, you would realize that we don't have the second and third line of therapy for relapsed patients. CLL is a field that is very, very exciting in scientific terms, along with one other disease, myeloma. I think it's the 2 diseases around which most of the trials revolve, and most of the research in new drugs is in those 2 diseases. So it's a sea of possibilities in the future. The other problems is that MRD has raised its level of significance, so we're not able to follow it with the old machines. Old technology cannot meet new requirements. This is one thing we need to upgrade. Of course, we need to monitor for side effects of treatment, but that is only available when the patient is on site. If they're home, yes, they can call me, we can discuss it, but it's not taking care, it's knowing that we have a problem and properly call the patient in. One major problem regarding patients with CLL is transformation to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and this is the second point where you also require an educated physician. He or she has to recognize the possibility of transformation and test for it. And this is something that every doctor should be aware of. The general message is, there is one thing that distinguishes us from all other living species, and that is the possibility to communicate through talking. I don't get to be a good doctor because I have a PhD or I have a position or I have a professorship. It's what the audience, and the audience in my case are my patients, see in my way of communicating with them, whether we develop trust and whether we reached the success. So not knowing the diagnosis, this is your diagnosis, it's malignant, it has a poor prognosis, this is your treatment, and we'll see how it goes. That's the summary of one consultant with a patient. It's the way how you deliver it. So always talk to the patients, and this is also your job as an advocacy organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A different perspective, of course. Now, we also have 2 others on the stage here. We have Jana, who we've brought up as an advocate. and Jana runs the Diagnosa Leukemia from Czech Republic. And Brian Koffman, who we know from, of course, the CLL Society, but I've asked him to talk in terms of the perspective of a patient today. And because actually they're both patients, but Brian will have unique perspective as doctor and patient. So Jana, I want to ask you, if I can, what you've heard from the two doctors and the difference of issues. What do you hear as an advocate when you hear that, and how can an advocate respond?
I feel that for our organization, which has a 20-year-old history and with the CML, I'm also a CML patient in the fourth line, 23 years on treatment. But 10 years ago, we expanded from a single disease organization into focused and addressing patients with all types of leukemias, myelodysplastic syndrome, and myeloproliferative diseases. So then we had to build on the experience from the CML field, and also, I would say, the positioning of our organization within the international networks was a key issue for connecting the patients with the medical society. The challenge in our country is that patient organizations, the model of setting them up comes basically from academia. A leader from the academic field feels there is a good benefit from a patient organization, but seeing the inactivity of the patients, which unfortunately is somehow a characteristic of our geographical situation. And then it's, of course, the organization gets instant credibility because you see the high-profile names behind it. Now, us as a really patient-led organization, it was difficult to gain this credibility instantly. So we had to build on our good reference in the CML area. And that helped us to connect with the Czech CLL Society, with the scientists who were willing, of course not all, that's up to each one's priority. Some have priority in the clinical work, in the publications and research, but others, they found it is beneficial to get more communication and connect with the patients. So what we do, the educational programs, is organizing conferences like this one, except that the audience is patients. And then throughout the last 10 years, I think it really became attractive for all CLL patients. That means those who are in the monitoring period. And here from I got the message exactly. It needs also to incorporate these patients and provide some information for them in terms of the holistic care of the patient, about nutrition, about prevention of infections. And this was somehow, I saw a gap in the healthcare system. These people were not fully engaged in all this, what can they even themselves do for their health, like to say, stop smoking. This we haven't heard, never. So, I still see some small gaps where this could be improved, not only to discuss the treatment options or to discuss with the who's on active monitoring what will be the next appointment for the monitoring, but also to fit something in between. So this is what I see is slowly, step by step, improving. In terms of access to therapies, I think that in the region we are true champions, although I see a gap in the first line of a subgroup of younger fit patients. The system does not allow for reimbursement of non-chemotherapy treatments. And somehow it's overlooked because it's a minority, a small group. However, we are pointing at this within what's possible to do. I am representing blood cancer patients in some working groups of the Ministry of Health and mainly in the patient committee of the health insurance associations. So I'm bringing these problems also backed by the opinion of the medical society, because I feel it's not enough just the patients complain, but it needs to be also, a verified demand, confirmed or approved and from the CLL study group. So we are aligned in the same direction.
Well, that's good. And I think the alignment becomes very important going forward. That's where the strength comes from. Now, Brian, you have a very different perspective. You have been a patient for quite some time, and you've seen treatments from CLL change. You've seen the way that doctors treat CLL patients change. And being a clinician yourself, that gives you an insight. When you hear the case of the clinicians and the professors, and you hear the advocates, what do you see as, if you're a patient in 2025, where do you see CLL as it affects you these days?
First, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share my perspective as a patient. And the one thing I do want to say, it's a very humbling task to try to present myself as a patient representing all patients. At the CLL Society, we say if you know one CLL patient, you know one CLL patient. Every patient is different. That is not true across other diseases. If somebody comes in, whether you're low, middle, high-income countries, and they have a sore throat, you find out whether it's strep or not strep. If it's strep, they get an antibiotic, amoxicillin, dirt cheap, get anywhere around the world. There's no other treatment, essentially, unless they're allergic to penicillin. It's all cut and dry. Even a lot of cancers are pretty cut and dry in terms of what they do. In CLL, the treatments are radically different based on a lot of the things we heard from the two professors. What's available? What does the patient want? What comorbidities, what other illness do they have? Heart disease, hypertension, kidney disease, all of these other things. How old are they? How young are they? All of these things are going on. There's wonderful choices out there, but unfortunately not all those choices are there. So what I've seen, and I was diagnosed 20 years ago, when I was diagnosed, there was no treatments that were shown to even add a day to your life, let alone cure you. They didn't even add a day to your life. There was no treatments that were shown to do that. And now we have an embarrassment of riches, if you have access to them, for countries that not only make you live longer, but live better. So what I've seen are issues first on that one level of how do I as a patient make sure I'm lucky. I live in the USA. I'm a physician with access. How do everybody get that kind of ability to get access, not only to the right treatments, but to the right management of those things, to the right knowledge about what choices. Dr. Kennedy talked about sequencing, how do you go from one therapy to another? All drugs in CLL are not curative. They're what we call palliative. They're going to knock back the disease. So I'm going to need another treatment and another treatment. And Dr. Kennedy also touched on this. Even if you don't need treatment, even if you're that 1 out of 3 patients who doesn't need treatment, And let me tell you, you can wreck a patient's life by treating them if they don't need treatment. What a wonderful message to be able to give if you're in a low and middle income country, to educate patients to say, let me help you by avoiding therapy, because you have a normal life expectancy. You're going to die with this disease, not from this disease. 1 out of 3 patients never needs an ounce of treatment. What a fabulous message. I mean, come to the symposium tomorrow morning. We're going to be talking about that. And then the next one we're going to be talking about a Charter of Rights the next day at 8 a.m. So please come to both of those. And I'll be there. Dr. Kennedy will be at one of those with me. So please come to those. Those will be great. But now that we're going to be living longer, these other issues come up. So it's going to be very interesting. And Nick York touched on this. So I'm now living with my CLL. Great. I don't want to die of COVID or pneumonia or flu, and I have a much higher risk. I don't want to die of a second cancer, breast or colon or prostate. I have a much higher risk skin cancer. 1 out of 2 of us gets a skin cancer. 1 out of 2 of us get a skin cancer, and many of us get 10 or 20 skin cancers. They're constantly being whacked off. So these become issues because the treatments are so darn good now, if you have access to them, that we're living longer, and we're dying again, not from our CLL, but with our CLL, but we're dying of complications. Does it matter if you die of a complication and you still die earlier? Do your family feel any better? Do you feel like I missed my grandkids growing up? So all of these are issues that I look at that have evolved. It's very different than when I was first diagnosed in 2005, which is nothing's going to make you live longer, and you better start thinking about what your arrangements are, because I had the flavor of CLL that just, you know, the chances of me living more than 5 years when I was diagnosed was 1 in 20. So look at me now, 20 years out. I'm wearing a mask because I'm on a therapy that's worked fabulously for me, but it's also kind of wiped out my immune system temporarily. Dr. Kennedy touched on that. So that's why I'm wearing a mask, so I can be protected. But here I am in Europe, flying all the way over from California. You know, and it's an incredible life that I've been given because of the research. So I'll just touch on one other thing. And you touched on this, Professor, access to clinical trials. If it wasn't for clinical trials, I would be dead. That's unequivocal. If I'd gotten standard of care, I'd be dead. Now, nobody doubts that, because I have the kind of CLL, something called 17p deletion, TP53, where I have mutations that don't respond to chemoimmunotherapy, and that was all that was available. And I jumped into early phase 3 phase 1 trials for different therapies. They saved my life, but I live in the US. I have access to those therapies. We've got to make these clinical trials available around the world to everyone who can get them there. And now I'm talking more as an advocate than as a patient, but I mean, for patients, often clinical trials are their absolute best option. So I really push that. So I could go on, but it's been an incredible time, a really exciting time. CLL is really on the cutting edge of what's happening. And the wonderful thing about it, it's a great way to, you can do research in CLL because you can biopsy the patient all the time, right? You just draw blood and you can look at the cancer. You know, if somebody has a colon cancer, you can't keep doing colonoscopies on them all the time. You know, you can't peek it, but in CLL, you can be constantly researching, growing knowledge. It's a fabulous time in CLL. I feel very lucky to be a patient, but I want to make sure everybody's as lucky as I am. You shouldn't have to be a physician living in the USA to get this kind of care.
Very good. You know, you said one thing, and the two of you, that really struck me, and I hadn't really thought of it this way before. You know, we all say, please just don't live by what you learn online. Get your medical opinion. And I always think of Google, in my context as a Canadian, the information I see is often American, which is a completely different healthcare system, and it's really not relevant to me. But the other thing about the online information that people often turn to is it's outdated. And as Brian says, there are so many advances over time, you're not really getting the true picture of where CLL treatment and the future of someone with CLL is sometimes.
I would add to that, be careful. As much as I love Johannes in AI hallucinates. and be very careful asking AI, because it'll give you results that were dead accurate 5 years ago, but it will
Yes.
make you dead. I mean, you got to really know, and you don't know because it sounds so convincing, but they're sometimes completely wrong. So you really have to be expert. You know, Johannes relies on his expert son. Not all of us have a son who's in, you know, who understands informatics, you know, so you got to be really careful, I mean, about AI. You know, when I look at it and I know stuff, I see how wrong it is. But in the areas that I don't know the stuff, I just assume it's right, which is dangerous because it's probably just as wrong in the areas I don't know about. I just don't know it. So, you know, that's one thing to be careful because it is changing so fast. What was dogma, what was absolute, the gospel, the top doctors in the world were telling me this is the way to treat me. They'd be convicted of malpractice now if I got that treatment, even 5 years after they said that. But they were perfectly correct at the time because that was the right treatment. You know, that's happening in the US, it's happening in most first world countries, it's not happening around the world.
Thank you. Now, we probably have time for one question. If there's a question out here, you have a great panel here. They're here to answer any questions you have. Is there anybody with a question? And Michael will get you a microphone, if that's the case, or Michael or whoever Michael has designated. Oh, I think we've got one back there, do we?
Raise your hand if you have a question. And Mike will bring it to you.
No.
Don't be shy.
I suppose I could ask a question, but I'd
Please.
prefer, does anybody here want to ask a question? Okay.
There we go. Just needs to get rolling, that's all.
Thank you very much. Cindy from Maximize Talent. That's a very marvelous explanation. Okay, as I told you, I'm from Thailand, so I'm not as lucky as you are. It's not from States. So I have a little question here. If you are in the situation that the patient is not able to afford for the medicine, and of course, the country welfare is not covered. So what do you suggest or recommend that we would do? Like clinical trial, I think it's one win-win strategy, but how are we going to push this to other countries that are needed? Thank you.
I feel like this is a question for me because I represent your point of view. The thing is, we're not magicians, we're physicians. I cannot provide the medicine that the country cannot provide. So this is a question to which I have no answer. There are two possibilities. Either you can try to get the drug abroad if you have sufficient private funds for that. And let me not sound like stimulating people to do that, but there are countries that are producing generic drugs or biosimilars by far lower prices than the originals. Now, we have had our suspicions as medical doctors whether generics and biosimilars can have the same effect as the originators. As time goes by, it has been proven for the biosimilars and generics that produce the same effect. So this is one point. The other point is you have private insurance, which covers your drugs and your methods, and that's something that quite a few people in my country can do that. That's why I still have a lot of time to spend at the private clinic, because patients with normal state insurance come to see me for their own additional insurance, or so, to have a second opinion or stuff like that. But enrolling in a clinical trial would be the best situation if you can find a way to get it through, I don't know, another country or countrymanship, or by direct access to the study active people, and maybe they'll accept you if it is possible to monitor you in a very, very professional way, because every study relies on perfect monitoring.
Let me add a couple other possibilities. They're not I'm not guaranteeing, but they're possibilities. That's the important work that we're looking to collaborate with the Max Foundation on. So they're doing it in 3 countries. Let's try to get it to more countries right now. And I say to my friends in industry that I see around the table, talk with the Max Foundation, talk with us about expanding those opportunities to get these drugs to people. The second thing I would say is if somebody can't afford this, their one back door is the National Institute of Health, NIH in the US. Their trials are completely free. You don't have to be a US citizen. Now, we're going through a lot of changes in the US, but there are trials there, and lots of my friends from Canada, friends from Mexico, other places go to the NIH and get their trials and get fabulous care, and everything is covered if you can get there. And they will pay for your hotels and your food and stuff once you're there. You have to get there. But once you're there, they will cover it. That is another possibility. So it's not somebody who can't afford to get to the US, and they often sometimes have to go many times. But that is another possibility for you. And the third thing I would say is check with the companies. Some of these companies have very generous plans to help people who are uninsured. They have compassionate use programs. They have things that you can get. So again, not every country has this, not every pharmaceutical company, but the pharmaceutical companies want to help you get that drug. They can't always help. Sometimes there's government regulations that don't allow them to do it. They can't discount. I mean, it's really weird, but you know, they try to help. So absolutely get on the phone and call the pharmaceutical companies and see, can you get the drugs? Doesn't always work, but it does work sometimes. So those are things. Look at the charities that are out there. There's charities that will help. Look at the drug companies themselves. Look at clinical trials, the NIH trials in particular, because all the costs are covered. Problems with a lot of the trials is, yeah, you get the drug for free, but you have to pay for the lab tests and the CT scans and the doctor's visits. So, you know, they tend to be expensive, but there are other options out there.
Thank you. I was going to add a perspective to this. I think Brian has come up with a number of practical approaches to it. And I was simply going to say that the global inequality of access to healthcare is a real problem and has political and economic roots. I was going to bat it back to the Advocates Network to say, how can you do it? So we could have been a good double act. I could have set you up there, Brian, and you've given those responses. But it takes me back to a reflection that I had listening to Professor Karanfilski speaking about what is at the core of what clinicians have to do, what we have to do, and that is keep people alive. So it's so important that we do all this extra stuff. Not extra stuff, it's fundamental human things about how we interact with each other. But if you're not alive, how can we ever begin to interact? And how can we begin to address those issues of quality of life? You have to be there in the first place. So it takes us back to that core issue of access to drugs that work. Does the Advocates Network have a response to this universal question of access?
Do you want to take that, Jana? Do you want to speak to that?
Well, we haven't answered to this, but we are trying from those options that were named here, and a long-year collaboration with the Max Foundation has shown that they have achieved great results, and I have seen an amazing map showing where they could arrange the access to certain medicines for certain patients, but it's not a universal solution. It always, even in those countries where there is access, it's limited by the, let's say, the travels of the patient to the hospital, everything which goes on his account. So there are always disparities even in these access programs by charity foundations. That's very unfortunate.
The options for compassionate use and organizations that assist patients are available in my country, but there is the other issue. I mean, to the NIH, somebody traveling, I don't see it in my country because they're so low level of standard living that only the travel to the States would be a problem. But the issue of compassionate use and assistance organizations raises another problem. If the compassionate use could be extended to one patient, then the one he knows says, well, I want it also, and then I want it also, and then I want it also. And companies and organizations cannot support all the patients. That's like an exclusion.
It is no doubt a problem. We're going to have to leave that discussion there, but very good points. Again, you'll hear these folks during the rest of the sessions, and they're open for you for your questions going forward. I want to thank you again, panel. You've been a good first panel, testing the waters with these people. I think they can get a little bit more active, but you picked up the slack. So thank you again.